I'm Caroline, and I am a lifelong lover of the paranormal. And today we are back with some more stories to illustrate how thin that line is between reality and something else. Our first story today comes from a guy named Jay. Now, Jay loves to go hiking in northern Arizona. He's got this perfect spot that he loves that's kind of a finger bluff that's got a huge cliff down either side. And if you look down 1,000 feet down there, there's a whole bunch of wildlife down there. There's creeks, there's lakes, there's everything that you could want from a camping spot in that spot. And he camped there all the time. And sometimes they would camp in that spot and then they would go out for some day hikes, he and his friends. And sometimes they would come back and there would be this stench at their campsite. And Jay describes it as kind of like horse sweat when you take a saddle off a horse that's been riding for a while, and skunkiness. And Jay's been out in the wilderness a lot, so he knows what elk smell like, what bears smell like. And it was none of those things. It was a smell that he could never quite explain. But the smell would always go away within a minute or two of coming back to camp, so it was nothing that he really paid much attention to. So Jay and his friend decide that they're going to go camping. It was kind of a last minute decision. They decided to go on up there. It was winter and everything, but they're experienced winter campers, so they're like, let's just go. Unfortunately, Jay's dog had just died and he'd had him cremated. And so he decided he was going to take his dog's ashes up to that spot and spread them while they were there. He figured it was the most fitting tribute that he could give to his companion. So they hadn't even started packing till like 7 p.m. on Friday. So by the time that they got even close, it was like 2 a.m. and it had started to snow. It was a blizzard and it was getting deeper by the minute. Thankfully, they had a 4x4 so they were able to traverse wherever they needed to go. But they kind of figured by the time they got there, they might actually be stuck there for a few days. But they figured they were fine because they had everything that they needed. But by the time they actually got to their camping spot and got their tent set up, it's like 3 a.m. Now, the snow had stopped by now, so they decided just, to kind of chill out from that white knuckle drive to get up there and everything. They just each grabbed a beer and went over to the cliff just to look out at the scenery and decompress for a few minutes. Now, it's only like a 30 or 40 foot walk from where they had set up their tents over to that little finger outlet that if you stand there, you can look down the 1,000 feet to see the lake and all of the wildlife and everything beneath you. And they were struck at how beautiful it was, because neither one of them, being, living in Arizona, had ever seen it in the wintertime before. And they just stood there in awe of how beautiful it was with that freshly fallen snow. So they're just standing there in that kind of enveloping silence that only a fresh snowfall can give you. And Jay and his friend are just talking about how lucky they are to be there at that moment. And they're looking at the beautiful scenery around them. They're taking sips on their beers. And they just happen to notice that they're actually starting to echo with the cliffs that are on the other side of the valley from them. So as soon as they heard that, Jay lets out his best war cry imitation and his buddy follows suit, and they're hooping and hollering until his friend's cry is cut off by what they describe as a manimal scream coming from behind them on the other side of their camp, like 200 feet behind them. Now on that side is a really rugged cliff that just goes straight down into a marshy area. But before the two of them can even process what they're hearing, from in front of them, they hear another splash. Huge. Sounds like somebody's just jumped in the water doing a cannonball or something. And then they hear what sounds like somebody swimming. They said it sounded just like a person swimming in the water and kicking their legs. But Jay says that this thing sounded more like a 500-pound poor swimmer fully clothed with boots and all paddling through the water, but they were kicking so hard you could hear the concussions of the legs hitting the water reverberating through that valley. But whatever it is, it's moving very deliberately in their direction to their side of the valley. And keep in mind, it's a super quiet winter night, and they could hear it climb out of the water and drip on the rocks below it, start stepping along the stones and crashing through the brush as it started to go up this 1,000-foot nearly vertical incline. At this point, Jay and his friend cannot believe what is happening. They don't even exactly know what is happening, but they do know Jay's friend has his gun in his holster on him, but Jay had left his gun back in his truck. So they stay there for a few more minutes, listening to this thing getting closer and closer, whatever it is, until they realize that whatever it is probably about a minute away from being right on top of them. At that point, they decide, okay, time to go back and get Jay's gun as well. So they both head back to the truck. They get to the truck, Jay gets his gun, and he and his friend stand there both ready for something to happen. And it doesn't. Nothing happens. Everything has gone silent. So they stay up for about another hour or so until they finally head back to their tent and go to sleep. And the rest of the trip was completely uneventful. Now, Jay says that after all of this, his question is, what animal at 3 a.m. after a blizzard with all kinds of fresh snow on the ground runs into freezing water in the direction of humans screaming? The only thing he can think of is that something was being chased by a predator, so it broke out of the woods and went into the water to get away from whatever this predator was. But if it's something trying to escape a predator, why would it head toward 1,000-foot vertical cliff? That's not the most efficient route to get away from a predator. And that also doesn't explain the howl that they heard from behind them. What was that? And the fact that whatever they heard sounded bipedal. But if it were a human hoaxer, as soon as they hit the water and started swimming, they would be in hypothermia trouble, considering it was the middle of winter. So to this day, Jay still cannot explain what they heard. Dennis and his dad love to go camping in the eastern western sea areas. They have great camping spots next to lakes and great trails and lots of great spaces where you can camp and then go out and do some day hikes while you're there. So this weekend that Dennis and his dad went camping, the campground was pretty full, which is not unusual for a summer weekend. But they were lucky enough, or so they thought, to find a little camp spot a little secluded away from everybody else. So they pitched their tents in that spot. Now, the first night that they were there was a little bear activity, but nothing unusual. It was a pretty uneventful night. Now, the second night, Dennis goes and crawls into his tent, and it's a backpacker tent, so it's pretty small. So as he describes it, his head hits one end and his toes hit the other. It's pretty small. But he climbs in and passes out because he's just exhausted from the hike that he and his dad did that day. Until around 3 a.m. when he wakes up to the sound of footsteps. Now, his dad is a diabetic, so he usually gets up 3 or 4 times during the night to use the bathroom. They were located close to the bathrooms, but then they should be headed off into that direction. But instead, they were coming closer to his tent until they stopped about 3 feet away when he starts hearing heavy breathing. Now, at first, Dennis still brushes it off as being his dad. Maybe his dad forgot his flashlight and got lost in the dark, and the breathing actually went away. So he actually falls asleep again until he's woken up a few minutes later to the breathing being right over his tent. Dennis says he had the feeling of pure terror rush straight up his spine. That was not his dad. So he laid there perfectly still, but he could hear the footprints continuing to circle the tent. And he had put the rain fly on the tent so he couldn't see through the tent, not to mention the fact that it was pretty much a new moon, so it was just about complete dark outside. So he couldn't see what was around his tent. Now, Dennis admits that he is generally a heavy sleeper. So he says that he just tries to convince himself that he's dreaming. But just as that thought pops into his head, he feels a single finger run the length of his foot through his tent. Real slow, real methodical. Now, at that point, Dennis figures he has to be dreaming because his foot is inside of his sleeping bag. Until he looks, and with what little ambient light there is, he sees that his foot is not inside his sleeping bag. His foot is bare and out of the sleeping bag. So he just completely froze as whatever it is stroked his foot for at least 1 or 2 full minutes. Then it just breathed heavy for a few more times and stood up and stared at the tent until it disappeared. Now, Dennis couldn't tell whether it had walked away or just simply vanished, but whatever the case is, he was up for the rest of the night. Now, once morning finally came and Dennis heard his dad coming out of his tent, Dennis bolts out of his tent and meets his dad at the fire. And he asks his dad if he'd gotten up at all the night before. And his dad said he'd gotten up around 2 a.m. because he thought he heard somebody rummaging around their campsite and rummaging around through their things. And at that point, Dennis told his dad his story. And they looked around the campsite and they could see that all of the gear that they had sitting on their table had been rearranged. Every item, but nothing taken. And a perfect circle of footprints around Dennis's tent. Kyle and 3 of his friends decide to go out camping on a boys' weekend. Now, they're only about a 5-mile hike off of the main road, but it's just them, their tents, their food, their drinks, and their fire starting gear. That's it. Now, about 11 o'clock, one of his friends, we'll just call him friend number 1, decides that he's going to walk alone back to the cars. He wants to go back into town to get more drinks. Now, the only thing that's going to sell them anything to drink at 11 o'clock at night is probably a good 15 to 20 miles away. So they all tell him, don't bother. We'll just do it tomorrow. But he says he's going to do it anyway. So Kyle gives him his good mag light and they all say good luck as friend number 1 heads back toward the cars. Now, about a half hour to an hour after friend number 1 has left, the 3 remaining campers start hearing these noises that they describe as a cross between an injured bear and somebody pretending to be Bigfoot. So they think it's friend number 1, so they call out to them, but nobody answers and the noises go away. Now, after about another 15 minutes or so of nothing happening, they figure their friend had actually left or that maybe he'd passed out in the woods or something. So they figured just to be safe, they would all hike back to where the cars were just to make sure that their friend had made it. And keep in mind, friend number 1 has the good mag light. So the other 3, all they have between them is like one old lantern that's not very bright and a phone to light their way back to the cars. Now, after about a mile or so, they start hearing those noises again, and they call out again, but again, nobody answers. Instead, they start hearing some branches snapping and some rustling going on in the direction of their camp. So at this point, they decide they're going to split up. One person, friend number 2, is going to head down to the cars and make sure everything is okay down there. And the other 2, Kyle and friend number 3, are going to head back toward camp and figure out what's going on back that way. So friend number 2 takes the lantern so he can find his way to the cars, which leaves Kyle and friend number 3 with nothing but a cell phone to guide them through the forest back to their campsite. So they head off. And after about a mile or so, when they should be back toward their camp, they can't find their fire. They can smell it, but they can't find it. So they walk around for a little bit longer until they finally do find it. And what they find is that the campfire has gone out. And it's not that it had just burned out. There aren't embers there. It has actually been put out. Somebody doused it with water. Now, needless to say, Kyle and his friend were a little freaked out because they didn't put out that fire. Who did? They haven't seen anybody else around. So super freaked out and not being able to start another fire because their fire pit was flooded out, they decided to pack up and nope their way out of there. So they packed everything up, everything except one thing, which we will get to later in the story, and started hiking their way back toward the cars. They get about a mile or so, right about the same place that they had separated from friend number 2 earlier when they heard those same tree snapping, rustling noises again. But instead of being back at the camp this time, those noises are coming from right behind them. So they just started booking it straight through the forest, and they ran for about 2 miles through the woods until they finally got to a trail. Once they hit the trail, they felt a little safer because they knew they were just moments away from finding their cars. But when they finally got to the cars, they noticed that 2 of their 3 cars were missing. So friend number 2, who was supposed to just go check out the cars and come back, he actually ended up getting in his car and leaving. And of course, Kyle and his friend had no idea why. So they're thinking their best course of action is to do the same thing. They get in the car, and once they do, they realize the car is kind of off kilter a little bit. They get out of the car, look at the tires, and one of the tires has a knife in it. They pull the knife out. Kyle realizes that's his knife, the thing that was missing from his campsite that he didn't even know was gone. Now they're really weirded out, but they can't drive anywhere. So they just start walking the highway on the way towards town until friend number 1, coming back from the beer run, actually stops and picks them up. At which point Kyle just kind of said, "Screw my car, I'll go back for it tomorrow." Now, it took a little time to get all 4 friends back together to figure out what happened that night. But what they did piece together is that friend 1 left just as he said he was going to, went into town, flirted with the cashier, got some drinks, and on his way back, picked up Kyle and friend number 3. It's friend 2's story that really freaked him out. Friend number 2 says that as soon as they split up and he was heading back to the cars to check on the cars, he heard noises as well. He turned, and in what little moonlight there was, he could see the silhouette of a man standing there with a knife. And they stared at each other for about 30 seconds until the other guy with the knife starts booking it straight at friend number 2. At which point, friend number 2 says he jumped in his car and got the hell out of Dodge. Now, Kyle says he doesn't know exactly who or what to believe, but he hasn't been camping in that spot since that night. He says he just can't quite get over the idea of how many times they may have been within feet of that 5th person. Paul is a camp counselor, and he works every summer for 5 weeks at a camp for kids. And one night, Paul and his friend decide to take a little night hike to get away from the kids for a little while. And they only hiked about a 1/4 mile, and they found a patch of grass, so they both lay down in the patch of grass and were just staring up at the stars. And as he and his friend are laying there, he hears the most beautiful sound of running water. Paul says it was like he'd never heard running water before. It never sounded so beautiful. He said all that he could imagine was this crisp, clean, clear water trickling over the rocks. And he got this image stuck in his head and then had this sudden urge to go find it. And not just an urge to go find it, but a need to go find it. He needed to find that creek. Now, behind them was dense forest and brush. So it would have been pretty hard to find at night, but it sounded like it was pretty close. So Paul looks at his friend and he can tell his friend is having the exact same thought that he is. So he thinks to himself, okay, let's just wait here for like 5 minutes and then see if I still think it's a good idea to go looking for this creek. And Paul says it felt like there was some kind of playful presence that was urging him to go find this running water. So he decides, yes, this is a good idea. And he stands up and his friend stands up with him and off they both go without saying a word to each other to go find this creek. So as Paul and his friend are going toward the sound, they notice the sound getting quieter and quieter. So they both stop, not knowing if they really want to go any further. And as they stood there kind of debating, the noise starts getting louder and louder until it sounds like they're standing next to a river. At which point, Paul says to his friend, let's come back and find it tomorrow. And they both agree that that's probably a good idea. But as soon as they made that decision, both the sound of the water and the urge to go find the water both completely disappeared. All they could hear was silence. But the presence that Paul said that he felt now felt like a sinister presence. And that feeling just started in the pit of his stomach and just kind of radiated out until it encompassed the rest of him. So Paul and his friend take off and they start walking back to camp rather quickly. And once they get there, they actually start talking about what it is that had just happened. And his friend says that he had the exact same urge to go find the water and the exact same internal battle to fight that urge to go find it. And it wasn't until they got back that they realized it was kind of like a trance, like a fog had been lifted, and what they had just experienced was not normal. It was like that urge had been placed there by something else. Because once the sound of the water stopped, the urge stopped. So the next morning, Paul and his friend go back to that spot to see if they could find the water, and they can't. They can't find any water anywhere near where they had been the night before. And they looked at some maps, and according to the maps, there wasn't any creeks or rivers anywhere near them. To this day, Paul says he is scared to imagine what would have happened had they continued looking for that creek. And what's really eerie is that he and his friend had the same thoughts and the same feelings at the same time without saying a word to one another. But in the end, he's grateful that they both made the decision to go back to the relative safety of their camp and leave whatever was out in the woods, out in the woods. About 20 years ago, Julie and 3 of her friends went camping at Kentucky Lake, technically known as Lake Barkley. It was late spring, early summer, something like that, but it was pretty hot outside. So after they got their campsite all set up, all of their tents up and everything like that, they decided to go down to the lake to cool off a little bit. Now they were camping at the far end of a little inlet. So it was, the inlet itself was probably about 300 yards long and it was about 150 yards wide. And they couldn't really see the right side of the main lake because of a bunch of trees and stuff. But they could see a good chunk of the main lake off to the left. Now the sun had already set, but she and her friends were still standing in the water up to about their shoulders, just cooling off because it was really hot and humid outside. And they're just standing in the water, chatting and staying cool, when all of a sudden above them, they can see like a fireball of a meteorite or something streak across the sky, and it lasted like 2 seconds. And it seemed like it was really close, but it's really hard to tell. But it looked like it landed just on the other side of those trees and maybe even landed in the lake. But as soon as it presumably landed, the entire lake lights up. Like the whole thing, the inlet that they were in, plus as far as they could see off to the left of the main lake. It was like the entire lake was lit up with spotlights or something. And then it flashed 2 or 3 times and went out. And there's no noise or anything with it. It was completely silent. And after a few more seconds of silence, one of the guys in the party says, did anybody else see that? At which point they spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out exactly what it was that they had all just seen. To this day, they have no idea what it was that they saw. And obviously it's not the strangest or the most terrifying story out there. But what's important is that they all saw it. If you like this video, go ahead and watch this one that YouTube has picked out just for you. See you next time on the In-Between.